The winter of 1807 descended upon the Wyoming Territory with a vengeance that would be remembered for generations. Snow piled against the log cabins of Redemption Hollow until the windows were half buried, and the wind howled through the mountain passes like a chorus of tormented spirits. It was in this frozen wasteland that Silas Brennan, a mountain man whose reputation stretched from the Rockies to the Missouri River, dragged two bound men through the settlement's main street on a rope. The horses' hooves crunched through ice-crusted snow as townspeople emerged from their homes, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Word spread faster than wildfire. Silas had captured the Mallory brothers, the most notorious horse thieves in 3 territories. For 18 months, Jake and Tom Mallory had plagued ranchers and settlers, stealing prime horseflesh and leaving families stranded in hostile country. The bounty on their heads had climbed to $200, a sum that could buy prime farmland, livestock, and seed enough to establish a prosperous homestead. Sheriff Warren Hutchins stood on the porch of his office, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as Silas approached. The mountain man was an imposing figure even by frontier standards, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and sinew, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes the color of winter ice. His buckskin jacket bore the stains of 100 campfires, and his rifle, a custom-made Hawken, never left his side. "Silas Brennan," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I'll be damned. You actually brought them in alive." Silas dismounted from his gray stallion, a magnificent animal he called Ghost. He pulled the rope, forcing the Mallory brothers to stumble forward. Jake Mallory, the older of the two, glared at the townspeople with undisguised hatred. His younger brother Tom kept his eyes on the ground, already accepting his fate. "They're alive because you wanted them that way," Silas said, his voice a deep rumble. "Otherwise, I'd have left them for the wolves 3 days back when they tried to ambush me." The crowd pressed closer, eager to see the legendary criminals up close. Farmers who had lost horses shouted insults. Women clutched their children and whispered prayers of gratitude. The blacksmith, a burly German named Klaus, called out, "How'd you track them in this weather, Silas? We couldn't find hide nor hair of them bastards." Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for something, or someone. "Where's Nora?" he asked suddenly. The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the assembly with uncomfortable silence. Sheriff Hutchins cleared his throat. "Nora? You mean Nora Clemens? What's she got to do with this?" "Everything," Silas said flatly. "I want her here before we discuss any reward." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Nora Clemens was known to everyone in Redemption Hollow, though rarely spoken of with kindness. She was a large woman, her weight the subject of cruel jokes and whispered gossip. She lived in a tiny, dilapidated cabin at the edge of town with her younger brother, Timothy, who had been crippled by a logging accident 5 years prior. Nora survived by doing odd jobs, washing clothes, cleaning the church, and cooking meals for the town jail, a task no one else wanted. "Silas," the sheriff said carefully, "let's get these prisoners secured and talk about the bounty. Nora's probably at the jailhouse anyway, preparing supper for the inmates." "We can—" "Get her now," Silas interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I won't discuss anything until she's present." A young boy was dispatched to fetch Nora, and an awkward silence settled over the crowd. People shuffled their feet and exchanged confused glances. What business did the mountain man have with the fat cook? It made no sense. 10 minutes later, Nora appeared at the far end of the street. She walked slowly, her considerable bulk wrapped in a faded wool coat that had been patched countless times. Her face, round and wind-chapped, showed both confusion and apprehension. At 32 years old, she had learned to expect nothing but humiliation from public attention. As she approached, Silas saw the way people parted before her, not with respect but with barely concealed disdain. He saw the smirks, heard the whispered comments. "What's the fat cook doing here? Did she eat one of the prisoners?" The jokes were old, cruel, and unoriginal. Nora reached the front of the crowd and stopped, her eyes finding Silas's face with surprise. "Mr. Brennan? They said you wanted to see me." "I did," Silas confirmed. He turned to Sheriff Hutchins. "Now we can discuss the reward." The sheriff produced a leather pouch heavy with coins. $200 is posted, in silver and gold coin. "You've earned every penny, Silas. Half the territory will sleep easier knowing these devils are behind bars." Silas took the pouch, feeling its weight. $200. He had dreamed of such a sum since childhood, enough to buy the land he'd always wanted, build a proper cabin, perhaps even start a family. It was a fortune on the frontier. "I want to split it," Silas announced clearly. $100 for me, $100 for Miss Nora Clemens. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then came the explosion of voices, laughter, protests, confused questions. The sheriff's jaw dropped. Klaus the blacksmith guffawed. A woman named Martha Perkins, the town's biggest gossip, actually doubled over with laughter. "Split it? With Nora?" someone shouted. "What for? Did she help you track them? Did she fight them?" Another voice called out, dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe she sat on one of them," Jake Mallory snarled from where he stood bound, earning vicious laughter from several onlookers. Nora's face flushed crimson. She took a step backward, wanting nothing more than to disappear. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation she had endured her entire life. "Mr. Brennan, I don't understand. I didn't do anything." "You did everything," Silas said firmly. He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Without Miss Clemens, I wouldn't have caught these men. She deserves half." Sheriff Hutchins moved closer, lowering his voice. "Silas, be reasonable. Nora's a good woman, does her job at the jail, but she had nothing to do with this capture. You tracked those thieves for 3 weeks through mountain passes. You risked your life. That money's yours by right." "Then by my right, I choose to share it," Silas replied. The crowd grew more agitated. Mrs. Perkins stepped forward, her face twisted with indignation. "This is absurd. Silas Brennan, have you lost your mind? That woman does nothing but eat and take up space. She was thrown out of the schoolhouse years ago because there wasn't room for proper children with her taking up a whole bench." The reminder of that humiliation cut deep. Nora had been 12 years old, already larger than most adults, when the schoolteacher, Mrs. Hadley, had asked her parents to keep her home. "We simply don't have the facilities," the teacher had explained, though everyone knew the real reason. The other parents had complained that Nora's size was disturbing to their children. "She's never done a worthwhile thing in her life," another townsperson added. "You're throwing away your fortune on someone who will just spend it on food." Silas's hand moved to his rifle, not threateningly, but with clear intent. The crowd quieted instantly. "The next person who insults Miss Clemens will answer to me," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I've dealt with cutthroats and outlaws all my life. I know cruelty when I see it. Right now, the cruelest people in this territory are standing in this street." He turned to Nora, who stood trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Clemens, do you remember a boy named Silas, about 20 years ago?" Nora wiped her eyes, confused. 20 years? There were children in the neighborhood, but I was 9 years old," Silas continued. "My family lived in that shack near Willow Creek, the one that collapsed the year after we left. We were poor, poorer than dirt. My father drank what little money we had, and my mother worked herself to death trying to feed us. You lived 3 houses down with your parents." Nora's eyes widened as distant memories began to surface. "The Brennan family? I remember. There was a thin boy, always hungry." "That was me," Silas confirmed. "I was small for my age, sickly, and I went to bed hungry more nights than not. The other children mocked me, called me skeleton boy, threw rocks at me. But there was one child who never joined in, a girl about my age who was mocked just as badly, but for different reasons." "I remember," Nora whispered, more tears flowing now. "You were kind. You never called me names." "You did more than that," Silas said. "Do you remember the day I got sick? Winter of 1787. I collapsed in the snow, and my father was too drunk to notice. You found me. You were only 10 years old, but you pulled me out of that snowbank and dragged me to your house. Your mother gave me soup, wrapped me in blankets. You sat with me all night while I shivered with fever." The crowd had gone completely silent now, listening despite themselves. Nora's voice was barely audible. "I remember. You were so cold. I thought you might die." "I would have," Silas said. "And when I recovered, when I could finally speak again, do you remember what I promised you?" Nora shook her head slowly. It was so long ago. I promised that if I ever made something of myself, if I ever had anything of value, I would share it with you. I said I would become a mountain man, the best tracker in the territories, and when I found my treasure, the biggest treasure of my life, I would give you half. The memory came flooding back to Nora now, clear as spring water. She had been sitting beside his sickbed, and the feverish boy had gripped her hand with surprising strength. "I'll be a mountain man," he had declared in his delirium, "like the ones in the stories. And when I find my greatest treasure, I'll share it with you because you saved me. I promise, Nora, I promise." She had patted his hand and told him to rest, thinking it was just fever talk, the wandering words of a sick child. After his family left town the following spring, she had forgotten the promise entirely. Life had been hard. Her parents had died young, leaving her to care for Timothy, and survival had consumed all her thoughts. "You remembered," Nora breathed, astonishment in her voice. "All these years you remembered a child's promise." "A promise is a promise," Silas said simply. "Doesn't matter how old you are when you make it. Doesn't matter if others think it's foolish. I gave you my word, and my word is all I have." Sheriff Hutchins stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Silas, that's a touching story, truly. But you were children. Children say things they don't mean all the time. No one would hold you to a promise made in delirium 20 years ago. Take the money. You've earned it." "The sheriff's right," Klaus added, his earlier mockery replaced with something like pity. "You're being a fool, Silas. What's Nora going to do with $100 anyway? She'll do what she damn well pleases," Silas interrupted sharply. "It's her money, her share. And if anyone in this town has a problem with that, they can settle it with me personally." The tension in the air was palpable. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Silas Brennan was supposed to take his reward, buy land, become wealthy and respected. Instead, he was throwing away half his fortune on the town's most pitied resident based on a childhood promise no one else even remembered. Mrs. Perkins couldn't contain herself. "This is ridiculous. You're choosing this woman over your own future, over a proper life? She's never contributed anything to this town. She's just a burden, taking up space and resources that could go to worthwhile people." The words hung in the air like poison. Nora's shoulders slumped, and she turned to leave, unable to bear any more humiliation. But Silas's voice stopped her. "Miss Clemens, please don't go." "Beer." He moved to stand between her and the crowd, his imposing figure suddenly protective. "These people need to hear something." He addressed the assembly with cold fury in his eyes. "You call Miss Clemens a burden? She cooks meals for prisoners that you won't even look at. She washes clothes for families who won't speak to her except to complain. She tends her brother when no one else would take him in after his accident. I've been all over this territory, met hundreds of people, and I've learned one thing. Character isn't about size or appearance. It's about what you do when no one's watching, when there's no reward, no recognition." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Miss Clemens saved my life when I was a boy. Not because she expected anything in return, not because anyone would praise her. She did it because it was right. That's more than I can say for most of you." "But a childhood promise?" someone protested. "That's not legally binding. You don't owe her anything." "I owe her everything!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the buildings. "I was dying in that snow, and she pulled me out. Without that, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have tracked the Mallorys. I wouldn't have earned this reward. Every bit of success I've had traces back to that moment when a 10-year-old girl chose kindness over cruelty." He turned back to Sheriff Hutchins. "Now, are you going to split this reward, or do I need to take it somewhere else?" The sheriff looked at the crowd, then at Silas, then at Nora's tear-stained face. Finally, he nodded. "If that's what you want, Silas, I'll count it out." As the sheriff began dividing the coins, the crowd slowly dispersed, muttering among themselves. Some were angry, others confused, and a few, very few, seemed thoughtful. Mrs. Perkins left in a huff, declaring that Silas Brennan had clearly gone mad from too many years in the mountains. When the counting was complete, Nora stood holding a small leather pouch containing $100 in mixed coins. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. Her hands shook as she clutched it. "Mr. Brennan, I don't know what to say," she managed. "This is too much. You need this money." "I need to keep my promises," Silas interrupted gently. "That's what I need." And please call me Silas. We're old friends, aren't we?" A small smile broke through Nora's tears. "Old friends? Yes, I suppose we are." Over the following weeks, the story of Silas's decision spread through Redemption Hollow like wildfire. Opinions were sharply divided. Many thought him a fool, throwing away his fortune on a woman who, in their view, contributed nothing. Others, particularly the older residents who remembered the Brennan family's poverty, found something admirable in his adherence to a childhood promise. But what truly shocked the town was what Nora did with her share of the reward. 3 weeks after receiving the money, Nora appeared at the land office. She purchased 5 acres just outside town, good land with a creek running through it and rich soil for farming. Then she hired Klaus the blacksmith to help build a small but sturdy cabin, using the rest of her money for materials and labor. "It's for Timothy," she explained when people asked. "He deserves a proper home, with room to move around and a view of the mountains he loved before his accident." But that wasn't all. Once the cabin was built and she and Timothy were settled, Nora did something unexpected. She used the land to start a garden, not just any garden, but one large enough to feed multiple families. She grew vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants, working from dawn to dusk despite her size making the labor difficult. By summer, Nora's garden was flourishing. She began selling produce at fair prices to families who couldn't afford the inflated costs at the general store. When she learned that old widow Hanson was going hungry because her pension was too small, Nora delivered vegetables to her door free of charge. When a family of new settlers arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Nora gave them seeds and taught them how to plant. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. People who had mocked Nora began to depend on her. Families who had called her worthless found themselves grateful for her generosity. By autumn, when an early frost threatened to destroy crops throughout the valley, it was Nora's careful planning and preserved vegetables that helped many families survive. Silas, meanwhile, had used his share of the reward to buy a small plot of land adjacent to Nora's property. He built a cabin there and began establishing himself as a guide and tracker for settlers moving through the territory. His reputation for integrity, reinforced by the story of his promise to Nora, brought him steady business. The two fell into an easy friendship. Silas would stop by Nora's cabin after long trips, and she would have hot meals waiting. Timothy, who had been bitter and depressed since his accident, found new purpose helping tend the garden from his chair. Slowly, tentatively, something deeper than friendship began to grow between Silas and Nora. It was Sheriff Hutchins who first noticed. "You're sweet on her," he observed one evening as he and Silas shared whiskey at the saloon. Silas didn't deny it. "She's remarkable. Always has been. It just took me 20 years to realize it." "The town's noticed too," the sheriff said carefully. "Opinions changing. People see what she's done with that land, how she's helped families. They're starting to feel ashamed of how they treated her." "They should be," Silas replied. "But shame's only worth something if it leads to change." The real turning point came in December, when a particularly harsh winter storm struck Redemption Hollow. Snow fell for 3 straight days, trapping families in their homes. Food supplies ran dangerously low. The general store was depleted, and the nearest town was unreachable through the mountain passes. It was Nora who saved them. She had spent the autumn preserving vegetables, smoking meat, and storing supplies with meticulous care. When the storm broke, she and Silas loaded a sled with food and began making deliveries to every family in town. They worked for days, trudging through waist-deep snow to ensure no one went hungry. Mrs. Perkins, the woman who had been most cruel to Nora, answered her door to find Nora standing there with a basket of preserved vegetables and dried meat. "Your children need to eat," Nora said simply, holding out the basket. Mrs. Perkins stared at the food, then at Nora's face, and began to cry. "I've been terrible to you, unforgivably terrible, and you're saving my family." "Children shouldn't suffer for their parents' mistakes," Nora replied. "Take the food. Keep your babies warm." By the time spring arrived, something fundamental had changed in Redemption Hollow. The town that had mocked and ostracized Nora Clemens now spoke her name with respect. Families who had considered her a burden recognized her as their savior. The change wasn't universal. There were still those who clung to their prejudices, but the tide had turned. It was on a warm May evening that Silas proposed. They were sitting on the porch of Nora's cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Timothy was inside, and they could hear him humming as he worked on a wood carving. "I kept my promise," Silas said quietly. "I shared my greatest treasure with you." "You did," Nora agreed, "and it changed my life. Timothy's life, maybe the whole town's life." "But I realized something," Silas continued. He reached over and took her hand, large, work-roughened, capable. "I shared my treasure, but I didn't claim my real treasure. You, Nora. You're what I've been searching for all along. I was just too stubborn to see it." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Silas, I'm not what people want in a wife. I'm not beautiful or graceful or—" "You're everything," Silas interrupted firmly. "You're kind, strong, resourceful, and brave. You've survived cruelty that would have broken most people, and instead of becoming bitter, you became generous. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to spend the rest of my life with you." The wedding took place in June, with nearly the entire town in attendance. Sheriff Hutchins officiated, and Klaus the blacksmith stood as Silas's best man. Mrs. Perkins, in a gesture that surprised everyone, organized the women of the town to prepare a feast for the celebration. As Silas and Nora stood before the assembled crowd, exchanging vows, the mountain man addressed the townspeople one final time. 20 years ago, I made a promise to a little girl who saved my life. Most of you thought that promise was foolish, worthless, the ramblings of a sick child. But here's what I learned. The promises we make when we're young, before we learn to calculate advantage, before we understand cynicism, those are sometimes the purest promises we ever make." He squeezed Nora's hand. "This woman taught me that kindness matters, that keeping your word matters, that people are worth more than their appearance or their circumstances. I'm the richest man in this territory, not because of the land I own, but because she agreed to marry me." The crowd erupted in applause. Even those who had been most skeptical of Silas's decision found themselves moved. They watched as the mountain man and the woman they had dismissed as worthless kissed to seal their union. And in that moment, many recognized their own prejudices for what they were. The Brennan homestead, as it came to be known, flourished over the following years. Silas continued his work as a tracker and guide, his reputation for integrity bringing steady income. Nora expanded her garden, eventually employing several townspeople to help manage the growing operation. Timothy, given purpose and dignity, became an accomplished craftsman, selling his wood carvings throughout the territory. They adopted 2 orphan children whose parents had died on the trail west, giving them the home and love they needed. The children grew strong and healthy, learning from both Silas and Nora the values that had brought their adoptive parents together. Keep your promises, show kindness, judge people by their character rather than their appearance. 5 years after the wedding, Sheriff Hutchins sat on the Brennan porch with Silas, watching Nora play with the children in the garden. "You know," the sheriff said, "some folks still talk about that day you gave away half your reward. They debate whether you were a fool or a saint." "Bro." Silas smiled, his weathered face creasing with contentment. "I was neither. I was just a man keeping a promise. That's all any of us should aim to be, people who keep their word, no matter how much time passes or how much others question us." "The town's better for it," Hutchins admitted. "For a while there, we were becoming hard people, mean people. You and Nora reminded us that kindness matters, that promises matter, that we're all connected, whether we like it or not." As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the sounds of laughter drifted from the Brennan homestead. A child's squeal of delight, Nora's warm chuckle, Timothy's encouraging words. It was the sound of family, of promises kept, of justice served not through courts or sheriffs, but through simple human decency. In the years that followed, the story of Silas Brennan and his childhood promise became legend in the Wyoming Territory. Travelers passing through Redemption Hollow would hear the tale and leave thoughtful, considering their own broken promises and forgotten vows. Some changed their behavior, others didn't. But the story endured, a reminder that the words we speak, even as children, even in fever dreams, even when others consider them meaningless, have power. The Brennan homestead grew into a prosperous ranch, eventually spanning over 100 acres. But Silas and Nora never forgot where it all began, with a promise made by a desperate boy to a kind girl in a moment when both were outcasts and the world seemed determined to crush them. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where Silas had proposed, Nora asked him a question. "Do you ever regret it? Giving away half that reward?" Silas pulled her close, this woman who had saved him twice, once from the snow, once from a life lived without love. "Never," he said firmly. "That money bought us land. But the promise bought us everything else. It bought us dignity, purpose, family. It bought us a life worth living." "The town remembers," Nora said softly. "Children learn about promises because of what you did." "Because of what we did," Silas corrected. "You chose kindness when you pulled that dying boy from the snow. I chose integrity when I kept my promise. Together, we built something better than either of us could have alone." As night fell over the homestead, the lights in the windows glowed warm and welcoming. The garden stretched out in neat rows, waiting for spring planting. The barn housed healthy livestock. In the cabin, their children studied by lamplight, and Timothy crafted another masterpiece from wood and patience. It was the fulfillment of a promise made in desperation and kept with determination. It was proof that justice isn't always found in courts or delivered by sheriffs. Sometimes, justice is as simple as keeping your word to someone the world has forgotten and showing everyone watching that character matters more than appearance, that integrity outlasts reputation, and that the promises of children, made in innocence before the world teaches us to lie, are sometimes the most important promises of all. The mountain man and the woman they had called worthless had built an empire of kindness, and in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the character of an entire town. The bounty money was long spent, but the promise it honored would echo through generations, a testament to the enduring power of keeping one's word.